Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here. As Sister Ileana already says, we're running on Dyer time. No problem at all. God bless you, brother. God bless you, brother Ruben. We're running on Dyer time. Jay will be with us any moment. So first of all, thank you all for being here already. What's up, Chloe? What's up, everybody? Orthodox Boomer Grandma, Damien Kuzmic, Ultra Dark. Glad to see all you guys here. Thank you all for your interest. Jay said that he was signing on, so that would be any moment. How are you guys doing? How's your life going today? Hi to you too, Jedediah. Lord bless you all. May the Lord preserve you, your families, your loved ones. Nothing but the health and all the grace of that the Lord has to offer us. So, it's cold here in Cyprus. How can it be cold in Cyprus? Like, how's it possible? But anyway, yeah, here it's getting a bit more towards the spring. This it's becoming less and less cold, so sooner or later the sun will show itself. God bless you to all the mods. Hearing everything repeat. Could it be that you have two templates open, brother? Two tabs, perhaps? God bless you to Ryan, my online family. We're going to have, as you already know by the title, we're going to talk about a very, very, very important topic, a very personal one, obviously. You're going to have, obviously, the man himself, Jay Dyer, who knows a thing or two about it. Um, going to talk about the Oriental and Eastern Orthodox Christologies, like mainly, obviously, what's happened on the Council of Chalcedon in 451. So we're going to delve into that one. Obviously, the metaphysics and Christology, the ecclesiopolitical history that was happening there, lots of stuff that was to be said about it. Also, a bit about ecumenism, when it is right and when it is wrong. Obviously, there's a wrong spirit about ecumenism. It can be used in a very negative manner, and obviously, Jay will delve into those topics a bit more. Weird too, me too. God bless you too, Mark. God bless you too, both of you, Marks. Mark Burian and Mark Rattel. Sooner or later, we're going to have full armor merchandise. I will have also a T-shirt line on, mainly Bible verses, obviously. Um, so we'll see what 2023 is going to bring us. Um, for those who have seen already, for the past month, I've been doing nothing else but to blast out content. Hopefully, quality content, which is beneficial for everyone who is interested. So, welcome, brother Tech Noir Graphics, Blazing Prawn. I want a beautiful beard. Yeah, you already have a beautiful beard, Mark. What are you talking about? I'm switching over to my mobile phone. Now it is very late here. Sure. Ha! Yeah, the conversation, mainly an adversarial conversation that will be had with Matt Slick, is still in the works. Somewhere around I want to say a couple of weeks, like mid-February. We're aiming at. He's very open. It's not something that's something unfamiliar for him. What I'm just want to have try to do is to like have the old classic old sola scriptura versus holy tradition type of conversation. I love Matt. Let first things be first. I hear a lot of stuff about him, but there's nothing personal from me against him. Maybe in the conversation itself that will change, but we'll see how that happens. Um, yeah, so what I'm doing mainly is like sending out invitations to people, We got a lot. We got a very interesting guest coming up, which I cannot tell you yet because I want to have a certain date before I doing some marketing on it. Let's see where Jay is staying. Like he has seen my messages. I've sent him the link. We'll see. There's no rush for us. Already got a bunch of great books. For those who are a bit familiar with this topic, already know this. Already know this. Obviously, I'm assuming that my audience or our audience are already a bit familiar with these types of topics, but I do want to have it laid out in a simple matter for the layperson, whoever it may be. I also got this one. Everybody knows these pretty much, like the Philip Schaff said, mainly on the seven ecumenical councils. Got a lot of reading to do. Thank the Lord, I have a lifetime in front of me, Lord willing. So lots of reading, lots of studying. Busy brewing that sugar, probably. Yeah. Like Chalk.com and the Tomcat Ali and the Shilajit and right. So we find yeah. Yeah. What can I say, Jupe? Yeah, like I do have a full-time job. I have to be in a train for 45 minutes, so like 2 times in a week I'm going to the office. That's a great time for me to read if there's a place to read and study. Not the ideal situation, but it is what it is. And mainly I'm not that much on my phone, or else I'm just reading. I have like this lamp in front of me on the front of my desk in order to see everything clearly. Right, Armenian Orthodox texts, three ecumenical councils. Absolutely, that's the Oriental position. Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus. Uh, and everything after Chalcedon, that was a robber synod. We have Dioscoros. We have things that have been happening around the time. So, for those who don't know, uh, probably a bunch of Oriental Orthodox won't be liking this, but I do have an inclination towards the diaphysis. And now, obviously, don't hate on me. I already got a bunch of Armenians on my head, like for like how can be an Armenian and believe in Chalcedon? I'm like please don't start that way. So um, all this whole session obviously is about reconciliation. Um, Saint Dioscorus was venerated in the Armenian Church until papists told us to stop. Very interesting history. Absolutely, absolutely. Like that's the type of stuff I really like. Like another book I really like is Nina Garsoyan, Studies on the Formation of Christian Armenia. And Nina Garsoyan has passed away like a half year ago. She is a Armenian French historian, and she has really delved out the Armenian Byzantine relationship, and especially the times of Christology. There even were Armenian Byzantine emperors, and there were pro Chalcedonian voices. And I'm very curious, obviously, what was happening there. So it just is a very interesting topic. So please do not hold it against me when I have a theological position that is different than yours. Like 5 years ago, I had a very different theological position as I have now. So the Lord will help us all. The Lord will give us His grace. The Lord will forgive us for everything that we're doing wrong. Everything which is good is from Him. I think we have him here. There he is.
How are you?
Very well. Very well. Thank you for being with us here today, sir.
Good. I don't know why my camera's not coming on.
That's weird. Do we have like a something in front of the camera?
I'm working on it. No, I don't. Let's see.
There we go. There he is, guys. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Jay. I hope you didn't have to be in a rush to get here. I hope
No,
not.
I'm sorry. It's early for me, so we had a lot going on today.
I
I'm good.
understand. First of all, thank you obviously for being here. This is not the first time I had you on. Uh, like the first 10 minutes, I already alluded a bit what we're going to talk about today. But first off, let me ask you, how are you doing?
I'm great. I'm busy. We had some really big interviews in the last a week or so, and that kind of led to a whole bunch more interviews. So things really ramped up in the last month. So I've just been pretty much covered up, but otherwise doing good. We had a good Orthodox Christmas in Florida, so I'm good. How are
Amazing,
you?
man. Yeah, I'm doing very well by the grace of God. Obviously, you already heard this a bunch of times already, but congratulations with 100,000 subscribers, your appearance on the Timcast.
Oh, thank
Obviously,
you.
as you mentioned before, for the past few weeks or months, things have been rolling out very interestingly for you. So, congratulations. Also, good luck with the event that you have on the 11th of February, right? Did I recall correctly?
Yeah, so we'll be live in Austin, Texas, and our live events are kind of like a 5-hour lecture series mixed with comedy. So we try to tie in stuff that relates to orthodoxy, stuff that relates to geopolitics, philosophy. I do a lecture from
Right.
my new book, and Jamie does a lecture now. She does kind of the Hollywood critique stuff, and then we have a friend who's a comedian, BG Cumby. He's going to be doing his stand up. So it's going to be a lot of fun. A lot of red pill people there. So if you want to get tickets to that, you can go to my YouTube or my Twitter or my YouTube or my website. You see the links for the live event at Eventbrite.
Sure will. Sure will. Unfortunately, I live in like a couple of thousand
Yeah,
kilometers
you're only
from
at
where you live.
2,000 miles away. So,
Right. Doesn't matter.
but if you have listeners in Texas,
I sure have. I sure have. Like I want to say, like 99% of the people who are watching my channel are from the states. Oddly
oh,
enough. So,
okay, that
so
works.
yeah, yeah, it is. It is.
I'm trying to share your show right now, so since I didn't realize that we were already live, let me
No
go back and
problem.
reshare it so we get some more. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much. There's no rush. It's not something very strict that needs to happen. Obviously, enjoying the topic. This is not a topic that you are like unfamiliar with. Obviously, um, as I already mentioned before, this is a topic which is very dear to my heart. It goes back to my ancestors. Obviously, for those who don't know, I'm Armenian. Um, Armenians are mainly Oriental Orthodox Christians, and the funny thing is, I actually hold to a Eastern Orthodox position, mainly on Christology. So there were already a bunch of Orientals who were like, "How can you be an Armenian and be a Chalcedonian?" I'm like if that's the way how people are like getting into that topic, that's I don't want to say annoying, but it's something I want to delve into. And you're the man for that. So thank you first off for being here for that.
Yeah, David's actually better than me on this, but I'm happy to talk on the topic because I know the basics of the theology. I think David has gone deeper into the historical accounts of it, especially the the writings of people like Severus and people like that. But I know the theology well enough to talk about
Sure do.
the main issues and the differences.
Sure do, yeah. Yeah, David Erhan, I had him like on my channel twice. We
Hmm.
really delved into like a whole variety of stuff on the subject. But the thing about your expertise, as far as I can see, obviously we have the Christology, but we also have the ecclesial political sphere and the history that the councils were in, and you also have an understanding of ecumenism and when it is right and when it is a heresy. Obviously, the title of this stream is called Reconciling the two Christologies, but then I want to ask you later on in the session, obviously, when it is a good thing that ecumenism is not used in this particular subject, because I don't want to stand against 1,500 years of theologies. I'm not capable to do so, but I do understand you have a very comprehensive way of looking at the church and also perhaps what the church could do in the future. So let me first off ask you with this question, a very simple one. What made you have the Eastern Orthodox position mainly on Christology?
Yeah, so I did put a considerable amount of time into the topic because when I first got into Orthodox theology in 2007, I think it's the case for everybody. You kind of get presented with a lot of different channels and options, and like there's the liberal Orthodox like David Bentley Hart, and there's the Universalism, and there's the Romanites is very anti-Western stuff, and there's all these different. There's this whole smattering of like other issues if you go the Orthodox route. That like if you're Roman Catholic, you don't really care about any of that. So I did eventually have to tackle this issue of Christology, but I also had a lot of interest in Christology because I understood the importance of how Christology is is reflective of Trinitarian theology. And then so the Trinity will determine the mode of your Christology. That will then determine your ecclesiology and your soteriology. So I kind of understood that, and that's why I realized that the Christological issues would be of the utmost importance, because that's really going to condition the way that we understand soteriology in the church. And so for me, it boiled down to a lot of different texts that I read. I started with God, History, Dialectic, Volume 1. That one was really important for laying out not just the essence, energy, distinction, and the fathers, but the later chapters in Volume 1 get into the dispute with Pyrrhus, the dispute with Severus, and the presuppositions that a lot of the 5th, 6th, 7th century Orientals had. And then I had to go and read Maximus's, dispute with Pyrrhus. I had to go read the 5th Council, the theology around the 5th Council, and understanding that there are a lot of errors and misconceptions that can come out of Chalcedon. And so when we understand that Chalcedon wasn't enough, we needed another council. That's the 5th Council is the most important for all this question. Now, you might think Ephesus is the most important, and it is. Ephesus definitely matters. And I'm happy to talk, at length about Ephesus as well, because in our view, what happens is that Ephesus is obviously Cyril, and then Chalcedon has Cyril. Yeah, that's the book I was going to go to. Chalcedon has Cyril as the sort of standard, and a lot of people don't know that they were testing the writings of Leo against Cyril. But I do think that Chalcedon left some things unclear and uncertain, and that's why there's the 5th Council. And so the key to understanding what the whole dispute is the 4th and the 5th Council. And what happens at the 5th Council is that they say that the 4th Council, that Ephesus Chalcedon has to be read in a neo-Cyrillian way. You have to read it in a Cyrillian way, and they explicitly reject the potential Nestorian readings of Chalcedon. So to be really clear about that, when St. Cyril is using the phrase miaphysis, one incarnate nature of God the Word, there's two different senses to the word hypostasis, and that's one of the main sources of confusion over the issue. In Nicaea, when they use hypostasis, for example, Athanasius in Nicaea, they use it to mean just simply an incarnate nature. That's it. An individuated incarnate nature. So you could speak, for example, of a hypostasis of a dog, hypostasis of a cat. It just means an individuated nature. That's all it meant, and that's why for Athanasius he was trying to defend the deity of the Son, right? And so hypostasis had that key usage there. But when we get to the Cappadocians, hypostasis begins to be used in a more precise way, particularly in Basil's letters, in Gregory Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa. So it doesn't mean that there's no sense in which it's just an incarnate nature, but it's more so specified to be the agent that has the nature, the subject. And that's a specification that the Cappadocians use. And then, as I understand, I find this, and I see this in Cyril in both ways. So when Cyril uses one incarnate nature of God the Word, he's just speaking of a single hypostasis, a single incarnation, right? The one being that's incarnate there. But if you look at the 2 letters to Sixcensus, which is at the appendix of this book, right? That's the later Cyril. Cyril doesn't have a problem using the terminology after the incarnation, after the resurrection, I should say, of 2 distinct natures. So, so hypostasis in this regard refers to the agent here, right? So I'm looking at Pano's quotes. I'm getting distracted. Yeah. Hypostasis can mean aerosol, secondary substance, or Plotinus is locus of consciousness, or a person, which is a patristic usage. Right. So person is in this sense going to be used for the subject or agent. So this is partly the dispute at Chalcedon, is the confusion over which usage is being had. So the key here is that when we get to the Fifth Council, and there's a great 2 books on the Fifth Council, is Meindorf's Byzantine Theology and the Kenneth Vesho book on the person of Christ and the Christology of Saint Justinian. And what happens there is that that's an attempt at reunion, and there's an admission that Chalcedon kind of left things unclear. It left things open. And so the admission is then, how are we going to understand hypostasis in the Fifth Council? Is it the product of the incarnation, or is it the ground of the incarnation? And so if we had the proper sense in which Cyril meant it, it's the ground of the incarnation and not a product of it. The Western tendency, especially like Roman Catholics or Calvinists or people that sort of stop at Chalcedon, they do tend to have a Nestorian reading. They'll read it as, oh, the hypostatic union is the one incarnate hypostasis of Christ is this product of the two natures. No, the hypostasis becomes the person or the subject that has both natures. And if you don't distinguish nature and person, this doesn't make any sense. That's why Severus says that the distinction between nature and person in the Trinity is not reflected into Christology.
Right.
But the problem is that in the Cappadocians it is, because that's where the distinction comes from. And the Cappadocians and Cyril, they matter for both Chalcedon and for the Fifth Council. So the solution is just simply that the Sixth Council reiterates that the subject or agent is the second person of the Godhead, the Logos. The human nature that he has when he assumed it was not personal. In other words, it doesn't have a subject. It's anhypostatic, considered in itself. But when it is assumed by the Logos, yeah, so Leontius, but more important than Leontius's book is Sophronius of Jerusalem. And that's because the Fifth Council takes not so much Leontius of Byzantium, he matters, but Leontius of Jerusalem, who has the phrase in hypostatize. And this is the key phrase that the Fifth Council uses to try to explain what was meant before. Yes, he does say that. I can give you the references where Severus says that. Severus is using the older terminology of they're called the Old Nicenes, where hypostasis just means a nature.
Guys, if you want to,
it doesn't mean the subject that has the nature or the agent. So I'm trying to explain. I don't know if people are like getting mad in the chat. I'm just trying to explain.
No, guys, already mentioned before James came in here, it's about enjoying the topic. Like, if you want to chime in, that's fine. Just keep it relevant and respectful. There's no need to do a theological.
If they want to come on a chat, we can have a chat. I mean, I'm fine to do that, but there is no human subject. So so people in the chat are all confused. God assuming human nature means that he's the God of the human subject. There is no human subject. Okay, at all. So in hypostatize means that the human nature that he assumed now exists in the mode of the personal Logos, who has that human nature. So that's the Fifth Reunion Council's explanation of how Chalcedon should have said things. And for a lot of the Orientals, that was sufficient. Then the problem becomes the conflicting saints, because we have different lists of saints, right? So it looks to me like, you've done enough reading on this where you've gotten sort of established in this matter that, I don't really have to rehearse a lot of the background to it, because if you read those texts, then you know that this then shifts by the time of Maximus to a debate about energies, right? So energies become the locus of the debate, because it's no longer about distinction between nature and person. It's now a distinction between two different types of energies. And does Christ have a human energy and a divine energy? And the Fifth Council also specified that, as well as the Sixth Council too, more precisely in the Sixth Council, that the human energy and will is deified by the divine energy and will. And to my mind, the locus of this debate really ends up being in the energy dispute. And if you have a clear understanding of two wills and two energies, and the energy signifies nature, as the Cappadocians taught, really the Cappadocians kind of solved this whole issue, right? So
Right.
the human nature of Christ participates in not the divine nature, but the divine energies that deify and transfigure the human nature and the human energy. So everything that he does, St. Cyril says, in a human way, he does divinely, and everything he does in a divine way, he does humanly. And that's the union is a true union via the energies. The energies are the key component that takes the human nature, deifies it, but it still retains its natural properties as being created. It never loses that property because natures can't cease being what they were, right? And if the energies signify the nature, then Christ always has a divine energy and he always has a human energy, and they perfectly are synergized to be a divine human operator or actor in all cases. And if you read John Damascus, that's how he interprets Cyril's one incarnate nature and one energy.
Right. So you already mentioned before, you already mentioned it a lot of times before, the importance of the Ordo Theologia, right? The order in which you do the theology, you already mentioned before. We, as Christians, obviously, the starting point is the Trinity, and the Trinity lays the foundation, obviously, how to do Christology, etc. So my question is, in a Miaphysis metaphysics, as we can say it, uh, what is happening like in the order theology? Like something do certain things block, for instance, like the Immaculate Conception, for instance, obviously would mean that Mary would not be in the same nature as we do. Therefore, the whole salvation does not occur for us, right? So, in that particular sense, in the order theological sense, I can see how that works. But what does happen when we have a Miaphysite Christology? Like, what does that entail logically? Logical
Well, that's
implications
why
of it.
it can go in different directions. So if it means a tertium quid, a third thing, then how is it still homoousios with us? And if it's a tertium quid or a third thing, how is it homoousios with the Trinity or the Father,
Right.
right? And then we have the questions of, well, what happened on the cross? Because if you read book 3 of John Damascus, he makes it very clear that the Orthodox view of what happened on the cross is that when Christ died, the human soul was severed from the human nature. Now, if he was a third thing, then do we think the divine nature died on the cross? I mean, this is silly, right? So we still in the cross, we still have to understand the distinction between the natures, not a separation or division. You'll notice that when John Damascus argues this out in book 3, he says that when Christ died, the human soul was severed from the human body, but the divine person of the Logos was still the person to that body and to that soul. So just because the body and the soul are severed does not mean the hypostatic union was severed. It always retained because
Right.
the Logos is a divine person. So even though the body and the soul are separated, he can still be the person to the body and the soul. As the divine person to that human soul, he descends into Hades. And there he breaks forth the power of Satan over us through death
Right.
by preaching the gospel in Hades. Then he resurrects, body and soul return, and he deifies that human nature. But the deified human nature, that deification occurs not via the divine ousia, but by the divine energies. And that's why
Right.
Cyril argues for the energies, that the energies are what deify the flesh of the in the Eucharist, because it's the exact same deified flesh of Christ resurrected. So there's no way to understand deification and hypostatic union without the energies doctrine. And one of my critiques of the Orientals is just that I never see a clear energies doctrine, because I'm not saying they don't talk about energies. I'm saying that they don't understand a clear energies doctrine where energies signifies nature. And that's another argument proving that there is a reflexivity between the Trinity and Christology. Because, I mean, you can disagree with John Damascus, I guess, if you're Oriental, but the way John Damascus presents the line of argumentation is that in book 1, he argues for the Trinity and the energies in relation to the created order. And then he takes that same principle and he applies divine person that has the divine nature, the divine will, and the divine energy and the effect of the energy in Christology. So nature, person, will, energy, and effect in chapter 3, book 3, chapter 15, are all distinguished along the exact same lines of principles that they're distinguished in Trinitarian theology. So there's a perfect reflexivity, not just between nature and person in the Trinity to Christology, but also between the essence energy distinction in the Trinity to Christology, if that makes sense. So he just does
Right.
the
It
same
makes
move.
sense.
And to
Yeah. So
me, that's why when we go and read, when we read Cyril's dispute with Pyrrhus, and it becomes a dispute about energies, the dispute becomes what I just said, applying the same principles of the essence energy distinction to what's going on in Christ and in his life. And we see that at all times, even though he's a divine person, he's really experiencing hunger and thirst in his human nature. He's the
makes
subject
sense.
to the human nature, just like he's the subject with the divine nature. So when he's walking on water, when he's transforming water to wine, those are powers proper to the divinity, but he's still doing this in a humanly way. Okay. So
Communicatio
we're
idiomatum.
not dividing Christ by saying that there's two natures. The principle of unity is the divine person who has the human nature, which is not personal or a subject in itself. It is anhypostatic, according to the Fifth Council. When it becomes assumed by the divinity, by the divine Christ, the Logos, it becomes personal, not on its own, but by virtue of the Logos who assumed it, not he, it. So it's never alone. It's just in qua means considered in itself. Considered in itself, the human nature of Christ would be impersonal or anhypostatic. But it's only personal by virtue of the person of the Logos who assumed it, not he, it. And that same dispute plays out when they have a debate between Maximus and Pyrrhus, and it becomes a question of dialectics. Because I don't recall if this is in Severus or not, but at least in Pyrrhus, the dispute is that Pyrrhus thinks that the human nature and human will are in a natural antipathy to the divine will. And that the human will and energy has to be overcome. And this is where we're getting into like Calvinistic territory and Augustinian territory, because Augustine seems to lean in this way as well. Augustine has tendencies toward this kind of a Christology of the humanity being predestined and being overcome, efficacious, irresistible grace being necessary to overcome the natural, quote unquote, antipathy that the human nature and will has to the divine. But Christ did not have that antipathy because he's a divine person and his humanity is not fallen. So he doesn't have any natural antipathy, quote unquote. There is no natural antipathy, by the way, but just using that terminology of sort of Western original sin, the blame. This is what when it gets into a question of the blameless and blameful passions. Maximus argues that Christ assumed the blameless passions, being hungry, thirsty, tired, which are a result of the fall, but they're not sinful. Right. So he willingly assumed those. He didn't have to have those things. He willingly took on our lowly state. But his nature, because he was born miraculously of the Virgin, does not possess the blameful passions, or what the West calls concupiscence, right? And that's the whole point of the virgin birth. And so Maximus argues that when Christ is praying to not die, let this cup pass from me, the whole locus of the debate centers on that text. He argues that Christ has a natural antipathy to death because that's put in us by nature and it's not inherently bad. And he says, so when Christ prays, he's submitting the human will that he possesses to the divine will. Doesn't mean it's destroyed. It doesn't mean it's overcome. It never loses its natural energy. It's just submitted to the divine will. And that's the pattern for us, to submit our human will to the divine will. It doesn't mean it's supplanted or destroyed. And it's not in a dialectical tension with God, because that's going in the direction of like the Lutheran and Augustinian and Calvinist positions, who think that the natural will itself is in a dialectical antipathy towards the divine. But that doesn't make any sense, because God made Adam to be in communion with him, right? So Adam had human nature in the garden and he was in communion with God before the fall, right? So how could there be, if he has we have the same natural will, Maximus argues, that Adam had. So how could the natural will itself be in a necessary dialectical tension with the divine will. It can't be. Now we have that tendency because we're fallen, but Christ isn't. Christ is not fallen, and that's the key point here. And that's why we have to say that Christ does not possess a gnomic will. And this is very important for this Christological dispute too, because this also backs up the Fifth Council's Curilian understanding of Chalcedon. Because one might say, for example, well, you could maybe you still think that Christ has a gnomic will, which means a created hypostasis. Because if Christ has a created hypostasis, that would mean that he wills according to dialectical reasoning, and that he lacks knowledge and he learns new facts. Because a gnomic will is a will that relates to having a beginning in time and reasoning in time and space, and it's connected to being a created hypostasis. So the Sixth Council says no, Christ does not have a gnomic will because he does not have a created hypostasis. And that excludes any Nestorian holdovers that might still be there. Now, the Fifth Council, I would argue, already excludes any of the Nestorian holdovers, because that's the purpose of the phrase "in hypostatized," is to exclude any Nestorian reading of Chalcedon. But by the Sixth Council, it gets even more precise because of this focus on the mode of willing, the gnomic mode of willing. And Maximus says the gnomic mode of willing is the willing proper to created hypostases and proper to following created hypostases. And so Adam and Eve have a gnomic mode of willing because they have a created hypostasis. They're created persons. They will within time and space and learn new facts and are ignorant of things. They waver. They vacillate. Christ does not have a gnomic will because he's not a created hypostasis. He does not learn new facts. He doesn't waver. He's omniscient. Now remember, he's fully a human, has a fully human nature. But there's no created human subject which learns new facts, that gets things wrong. He didn't know the end of this kind of stuff, right? You can go all the way back to Basil in letter 235, I think, 236, where Basil explains that these are just this is just phraseology about the last day, because Jesus says other things like "No one is good but the Father." Oh, so the Holy Spirit's not good, right? It's just phraseology. He's not literally saying literally no one is good but the Father, right? But so when you take that phraseology like that, this is where the Arians get this reading of those texts, right? But I'm saying that by the Sixth Council, because the debate is about the gnomic will, the gnomic will itself also disproves any Nestorian reading of Chalcedon or any of the Western Nestorian tendencies, because the dogma of the Sixth Council is that Christ does not have a created hypostasis because he does not have a gnomic will.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. A lot of sense. Pretty much the reason why I am an Eastern Orthodox if it comes to Christology. Every Orientals out there, my apologies. Let this not be the end all be all of the reason of this session. This is just enjoying the topic. The Lord willing, I have a whole life in front of me to study this topic. So if you have recommendations, please send them my way, but please don't bark in the chat, please. But I did read.
Okay, so
as far as
I answer it. So somebody's asking,
well,
well, what does it mean that Christ died or tasted death? I don't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. But
nope, go ahead.
So the divine subject of the Logos really did taste death and undergo death, meaning the severing of the human soul from the human body. That's how we understand that. So it doesn't mean that there's a human subject, Jesus of Nazareth, that died. No. The divine person of the Logos really experienced in his human nature the severing of the human soul from the human body. That's death. So that's what I mean.
Right. And like after reading John of Damascus on the Orthodox faith, Maximus the Confessor, Palamas, even especially on the essence energies distinction, which is actually very relevant. Obviously, what I also I've read an article which tried to show before Ephesus and Chalcedon how the essence energy distinction were, for instance, in Athanasius, in the Cappadocians, etc., so that the concept they were teaching was present right there. So reading all of that, I had to consider two natures, and especially that the properties of the nature and also the energy that they have, like it just makes more sense for me right now. But having said that, I did not read Severus yet. I did not read Dioscoros yet. I did not read a lot of books yet. So have mercy on me. Have patience with
Well,
me. But
what you'll notice in especially Severus, because that's the one that I'm more familiar with, you'll notice that Severus sees these things in a dialectical way, just like Pyrrhus does. But in Severus's debate, it's about the natures. In Pyrrhus's debate, it's about the wills and the energies. So the point is that it's the second person of the Godhead assuming a human nature. He does deify that human nature, but the human nature never loses the natural properties that it has. And so if it does, then we would be at a tertium quid. And a tertium quid is not consubstantial with us, and it's not consubstantial with God. So people are saying, well, but Severus doesn't argue that. No, Severus does argue that there's a dialectical relationship between the fundamental distinction between the natures. And so there has to, in his mind, because there's a dialectical opposition between God, and he uses Neoplatonic ideology here for the nature of the divine and the nature of the human. He says that this union has to be a blending of the natures because of the dialectical opposition between the two. And what I'm trying to stress is that the presuppositions of Orthodox theology are to reject Hellenic dialectics. That's the point here.
absolutely. So, um, as you already know, church history hasn't been always been perfect. Like it doesn't have to be. Like the Lord can use His imperfect vessels for His perfect purpose. Like the dispute about Christology is one of the more ancient ones. So that it means a lot. Obviously, schisms in the entire body of Christ aren't preferable. Obviously, but I do.
Well,
I'm
and think
very
about it too, like
interested.
if we think about energies again, I mean, if the saints and the relics perform miracles, okay, what energy is that that's performing that? So we know we're post resurrection of Christ, right? What energy is it by which a saint performs a miracle or a relic? Is it Christ's human nature? Is it the divine nature? Is it divine energy? It's the divine energy. But how do we participate in the divine energy? Well, Cyril says by the Eucharist, right? And Cyril says in the first and second letter to Sextensis, that we're not participating in the divine nature. When you eat the Eucharist, you're not eating the divine nature. We always ask the Roman Catholics this. If you believe in the real presence, what are you eating? And they don't know. Is it a created grace? Is it divine essence? What is it? You're participating in the uncreated energies. And that's the only way to explain the rest of this. And so if you read, like you said, I'm glad you mentioned that book, the Palamos versus Barlium debate, because that whole debate shifts from God's relationship to the created order and energies in relationship to the Trinity and creation. The whole debate then shifts to what are we participating in? It becomes a participatory discussion and debate. Yes. And the question is, what in our deification, if it's a tertium quid, then it would be a new nature that we're participating in, some third kind of nature. It's not the divine nature that we're participating in. The only other option has to be, unless you want to believe in the Roman Catholic doctrine of created graces, is that we have to be participating in an energy, divine energy, distinct from the divine essence. And so that would, by default, prove the entire essence energy distinction of the Orthodox position. And that, by extension, in my view, would refute the Oriental position.
Right. Exactly. And obviously, for those who know Cyril, know about his 12 anathemas, and one of his 12 anathemas is that you have to say that Christ has suffered in the flesh, and he has hammered it on 1 Peter 4 verse 1, Romans 8:3, where it says that Christ has died in the flesh, right? So when I'm thinking about the Miaphysite position, like I'm like questioning myself, like how does that work then? Like in the Eastern Orthodox Christology, it makes sense. But in the Miaphysite position, I'm like, how does that play out? So I don't know
Well,
if you
the
have.
divinity is impassible, and every church father that I can think of that talks about the divine essence, the divine nature, speaks of it as impassible, right? It doesn't. It's not subject to change. It's not acted upon. It's not in time and space. It's not partitioned out. Has no parts, right? So if that's the nature of divinity, then we have to have a distinction between nature and person to explain that it's the second person of the Godhead, not the whole Trinity, right? The second person of the Godhead that becomes incarnate. And when he undergoes death, he, the subject, really does experience death, not in his divinity, because divinity is impassible. Divinity can't die. But as the subject to the human nature that he possesses, he really experiences the severing of soul and body. So, in my view, and I've had a lot of debates with people who have, the swing in the direction of monophysite or monophysite or whatever. And I've had a lot of debates with people that go the other direction in the Nestorian type of direction, whether it's Calvinists, Roman Catholics, or Orientals. This debate usually comes back to being, in my view, not just easily solved by what you're talking about with, the tertium quid or the Eucharist, but also the death. Because if you read book 3 of John Damascus, I can't understand how any other position could make sense of what's happening at Christ's death. Because in our position, we are admitting the reality of the death in the severing of soul from body. We're admitting that never compromises the hypostatic union, because Christ is still the divine person to that human nature, even when the body and soul are separated. The harrowing of Hades doctrine, I don't know actually what the Oriental doctrine of the harrowing is. Do they have a harrowing doctrine?
They do.
Okay.
They do.
So they would agree then presumably with us that Christ descends into Hades. But what's descending into Hades? Like, is it the divine nature that's dying and descending into Hades? Or is it the divine person who is the person to the human soul and the human body that have been severed? Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Makes sense. Like a great biblical analogy was, obviously we believe in the resurrection of everybody, right? So our bodies, when we die, it's the separation of the spirit from the body. The body goes into the earth and the spirit goes back to God, right? But when Christ comes again, like in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, it says that when Christ comes, we come with him, or they come with him, I should say. The question is, what is the they? It's obviously their spirits, and then their body from the earth. Then they meet each other in the air. So even in, obviously we are not God-men, obviously, but I can see that the physical side and the spiritual side can be used as a single person. If I correct me if I'm wrong, but does that make, is that an analogy in and of itself would make sense? We as human beings, we are obviously one hypostasis with one human nature. When we die, our spirit or our soul separates from our body. So what's the difference actually compared with Christ's death or separation? If we can delve into that a bit
Yeah.
more.
So Cyril makes an analogy. He calls it the henotic union. He makes it as he says that the two natures in Christ are like the union of body and soul. And he's making an analogy saying that the way that the soul fully interpenetrates the body and the body fully interpenetrates the soul is like the union in the two natures in Christ, that the divine nature and the human nature fully interpenetrate one another. Absolutely. We totally agree with that. But human persons are not reducible to just a body and a soul. So again, there's an old Nicene usage of hypostasis, which just means an incarnate nature or an individual nature. After the Cappadocians, this becomes more precise to distinguish nature and person, to distinguish not just in individual natures or individual subjects, but the haver of the nature, the subject, the agent. So you and I share human nature. You have a body, soul, and a will. I have a body, soul, will. Okay, well, then what makes us unique? It's not just bodily features, beards, eyebrows, whatever, eye color. Those are idiomata. There's a specific thing that makes me J and you Vartan. And that after the Cappadocians and up into the fifth and sixth council, that becomes the subject or the agent or hypostasis in that particular usage. So I'm the person, hypostasis, agent, subject J. You're the person, hypostasis, subject, agent, Vartan. And that doesn't exclude an incarnate nature. It's just more precise because you are an incarnate nature or hypostasis, but hypostasis can also be more specific to refer to the specific agent or person that has the nature. That is directly from the Trinity. Okay. The Trinity is not three incarnate natures or three individuated natures. That would be tritheism. And one of the Monophysites did go in that direction. His name is John Philoponus. John Philoponus said that a hypostasis is merely an individuated nature, and he's using the old Nicene definition. That would mean that we're tritheists. That would mean that the Trinity is three individuated natures. That's tritheism. It's not. It's three hypostases, one nature. So there's a distinction between person and nature in the Trinity. Now, somebody in the chat said, yeah, but the distinction between person and nature in the Trinity is not equivalent to the distinction between person and nature in humans. I know it's not equivalent. It's analogical. This analogy comes from the Cappadocians. I'm not mad at you. I'm just saying to people in the chat. Like, if you read the Cappadocians, they make this distinction between saying that the distinction between person and nature in human beings is like, not equivalent, not univocal, like the distinction between nature and person in the Trinity. And if you just get that part right, then the Christology will perfectly flow from this. And by the way, the human anthropology also flows from this. That's what I'm trying to say. So my point is that somebody in the chat was denying that reflexivity. I'm saying the Cappadocians are the one that makes that make the reflexivity argument. And they don't just argue that it's a reflexivity from nature and person in the Trinity to Christology. It's a reflexivity that's also reflected in human anthropology.
Right. By the way, you pronounced my name like perfectly. So kudos to you. Yeah, makes sense. So, by the way, I see a bunch of book recommendations.
No, that's not. So again, people are talking about this stuff, and
you know how the internet is. I don't have to tell you.
Invite them on, like, if you want to. It's your show. I'm not going to tell you.
No, right? Yeah, maybe next time. Like, I wasn't prepared. That I obviously like when people are involved and they're invested somewhat, but not in such a way where it just gets annoying. But so,
how
by the way, folks,
to an historian? I don't understand what these people are talking about. It's a reunion council.
But
I mean,
you know what the funny
fifth council is a reunion council.
But you know what actually the funny thing actually is? And I'm not against the brother who said it, but he says, like, brother, the first three councils, Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus. And I'm like, but as I mentioned before, already mentioned before, that the Cappadocians were already teaching principles that are Chalcedonian in some sense.
Of course.
So, like the way.
Well, I just don't understand how, if the locus of the debate becomes about nature and person and whether it's reflexive between the Trinity and Christology, I mean, that's in the Cappadocians. So why would anybody have a problem with this? And the reason that, if I recall, Severus has a problem with this is because he understands that if there is a reflexivity, then his position's wrong. So he has to say there is no reflexivity between nature and person in the Trinity and nature and person in Christology, because that would lead to the Orthodox position.
Exactly. So let me ask you a bit more on the subject of the session. When we would say that the reconciliation between the two churches, mainly not necessarily on Christology, am I being too optimistic?
No, because the issue, if we look at the Fifth Council, in my view, and I don't actually, I mean, I've just heard people saying that a lot of people in the Oriental sphere don't have a problem with the theology of the Fifth Council itself. And so if they don't have a problem with the theology, then the question then becomes the conflicting saints, right? Because, I mean, we can't admit Severus as a saint. So that's the issue.
Absolutely. What I wanted to mention before, by the way, obviously when I'm trying to read my own Armenian heritage, here we have Nina Garsoyan, Studies on the Formation of Christian Armenia. Another book one is on its way itself. She has passed away like a half year ago. She's an Armenian French historian. She specialized mainly on the Armenian-Byzantine relationship. So there were even Armenian-Byzantine emperors, and there were also pro-Chalcedonian movements within Armenia. So the unfortunate thing is a lot of her work is in French. So I don't speak French, unfortunately. So, but I do sense there are obviously like no group is monolithic. Like, be honest, like no group is monolithic in any sense. So I'm really curious about what happened then. So, but you already mentioned before, it's not something that we don't have to be pessimistic in order to see the church coming together on this topic, right?
Well, for some people, there already is progress in terms of, like I said, understand the Fifth Council. People in the chat are taking issue with it, but I mean, I'd like to hear anybody who wants to, like, they can come to the Discord. We open up our Discord to have conversations with any of these people anytime they want. So if anybody wants to come to the Discord and have a conversation, you're welcome to. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just that if both sides have also excommunicated people, I don't know how we would get past that one. I mean, in my view, orthodoxy is correct. I mean, again, all of the people saying all this stuff, like, isn't Palamos going to solve this? Because if the participation is in the energies doctrine is going to prove our position, right?
Right.
I mean, how is it that Palamos is correct on all this, but he's a heretic? I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? If Palamos is correct on participation, then that proves our position, and it proves all the other stuff that we're talking about here, right?
Right. So my next question would be, what exactly is the heresy of ecumenism, which is a very special subject. What can you tell us about ecumenism and what the dangers of it could be?
So ecumenism ultimately was just the idea of the ecumenical councils to have reunion councils that bring people back into unity, right?
Right.
So if that's what it means, then that's not a problem. We can agree to that. But what happens is that over time, ecumenism in right around the turn of the last century, it starts to be utilized by geopolitical powers that want to steer religion in their direction, and particularly certain powerful families like the Rockefellers, in their own biographies, talk at length about putting tremendous amounts of money into this movement to steer it in their direction. And they have that as their goal. For example, if you read the Rockefellers authorized biography by Collier and Horowitz, there's a whole chapter on ecumenism and them putting money into it. And so the further that we move up in the 20th century, the more and more this becomes a movement towards geopolitical one world government, one world religion agendas. So that's what ecumenism is about nowadays, unfortunately.
Right.
It doesn't mean that it's not possible to have dialogue, and that's what we should do. But the presupposition of the ecumenists is that dialogue is for everybody to come to some new conclusion, because everybody's wrong. Oh, we're all
Right.
limited. We're all wrong. There's no true church. We're all part of a church that's in process, in a dialogical process towards some new third thing in the future. But that's Marxist praxis. That's Hegelian dialectical process. And from the Orthodox perspective, there's a continuity of the church in every age. So there's never been a time when there wasn't a church, right? There's never been a time when everybody was wrong and we're all trying to find a new third thing, right? So that's ultimately what ecumenism is about now, and it's just basically it's an ecclesiological heresy ultimately, because it's a denial of the reality of the theanthropic union in the church. The church is the body of the God man. It is the theanthropos on earth. And so, if ecumenism is the case in this 20th century sense, then that means that there's not a true church and we're moving to church. Okay. But that's all, again, dialectical process theology. And it's just a denial of the fact that in every age there is one holy Catholic Apostolic Church.
Right. It is like, yeah, we have seen, like, for the past few decades, that from the Coptic Church, that they were trying to, like, become back again with Eastern Orthodox. But then the whole problem is also we have like 1,500 years of canon laws, of traditions, and those types of stuff. And what I've heard mainly of the Eastern Orthodox is that we are waiting for the other churches to repent and to come back to us. Like when we are anathematizing like the others or the heretics, we don't condemn them to hell in that particular sense. We are waiting that they come back again.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the purpose of anathemas is restoration, not destruction.
right, which a lot of people get confused anyway.
That's
But
true. Yeah.
yeah, um, so yeah, obviously the body decides what's going to happen. The church itself decides who becomes a saint. Like for instance, when we die, like maybe 200 years ago, you could be a saint. I'm just saying something, right? So the body's going to decide. So I'm very curious what's going to happen. Obviously, I want the two churches, all the churches, to come together. But I don't want to sound like a Marxist hippie, like, oh, just like to come together. Like, no.
Sure.
So
Well, no, the desire for the reunion is 100% authentic. That's what we should have, right?
right,
I mean, that's a healthy desire, sure.
yeah,
By the
but
way,
it
so
should.
people again follow the. I agree with follow the Christ in the chat. Like, we're not saying Ephesus was wrong. We're saying that you have to have the Cappadocian distinction between nature and person, because if you don't have that, then there's no refutation of Sabellianism. We would be modalists. And
Right,
if we're not going to admit reflexivity between Trinity and Christology, uh, then you'd have to admit our position. Then Severus is wrong. So again, you can read the Cappadocians very clearly make the distinction between nature and person in the Trinity. It's their Trinitarian theology that's accepted at Constantinople I, and it's all grounded on the distinction between nature and person, right? Letter 38 of Basil, okay, on the Holy Spirit, against Eunomius by Nyssa, against Eunomius by Basil. I mean, all of these things are conditioned on the distinction between nature and hypostasis in the Trinity. So if we come to Christology, the hypostasis of the Son is who is incarnate. That's not the divine nature. That's the second person who possesses the divine nature, stepping into time and space, entering into a mode of existence that the Father and the Son don't enter into, right? So it's not just a joining of two natures into a new nature. And this is what you guys are so frozen at. Not you, but the people in the chat, right? It's not human nature plus divine nature equals tertium quid new nature. Okay. It's the person who has the divine nature, assuming human nature, deifying that human nature, but never destroying the property of the human nature. That's how the death is possible. So do you understand that if it's a new tertium quid thing, then what happened in the death? There's no way for you guys to explain that death. And you're just saying, well, he tasted death. Of course, yeah, nobody's denying that he tasted death. He who and how? The new third thing died? The divine nature died? If you don't have what we have in these distinctions, you're not going to be able to make sense of these basic ideas.
right. So
And
anyway,
Ephesus is
guys,
not vague. I don't know whether people are talking about Ephesus vague. Chalcedon was vague, and that's why the Fifth Council says you can't interpret Chalcedon according to what they called an Antiochian reading.
right. But it is a fact, right, that the Oriental, mainly, if I can speak about the Armenian Church, we do have a Antiochian interpretation of Christology, like obviously Severus of Antioch, etc. So, but there's, yeah. So, but by the way, I got one of these. You probably already know them. You know this one, right? I don't have to tell you.
Yeah, I've read almost all that volume. Yeah,
Yeah, like
it's a
I've
good
I've
one.
been I've been looking at what's all in there. Probably I've read like 1/9 or 1/10 of what's in there, so I got a lot of work to do. So obviously I bought them for like 1/5 of the price. So yeah, there's so much in there that is so beneficial for all of us. So thank you everybody in the chat who is actually involved. I've got a lot of homework to do myself, so you gave me a lot of food for thought. Lord willing, who knows? Maybe in 5 years there will be so much more happening. So, Brother Jay, what can I say? Thank you very much for this in-depth explanation of yeah, mainly the schisms, the Christologies, what is happening. Thank you very much. I wish you nothing but the
Absolutely.
very
Yeah, thank
best.
you. And I want to add, so I'm not saying that
Please
Chalcedon
do.
is Nestorian. So people in the chat are just losing their mind. Every ecumenical council leaves certain things unclarified and unanswered. And so that's why there's the next council, right? So when it comes to Trinitarian theology, for example, Constantinople I is pretty much the definitive Trinitarian council. We don't have any more Trinity debates until the Middle Ages for the Orthodox, right? So it's not until the Palamite councils when we get into the intra-Trinitarian relationships and Gregory of Cyprus that there's a new statement that defines or explicates the Trinitarian doctrine. So does that mean that Constantinople I was deficient? No, it just didn't answer everything. It didn't deal with every possible objection. And there can be areas of lack of clarity in an ecumenical council. And so the next council comes along and says, okay, these people have a valid criticism that it could be read in a different way. And so here's the clarification. That's it. So I don't understand why that's so um, problematic to some of these people. Why don't these people just come join the Discord?
Maybe next time I can place the link in the chat, but
Oh,
I was already planning to close it off a bit. So, but
okay,
obviously
no,
there's
that's fine.
that's okay. Lord willing, maybe next time. Um, as I said
Yeah,
before,
I didn't realize. So the chat is like right on the screen.
right,
So like
yeah.
when I'm trying to talk to you, I see all the chat. So I
Like
apologize.
you have no problem, but you can the screen. You can also like
I know. I just didn't think
complete.
about it. I was just like looking up, and then I saw all the chat, and I
You're
kept
letting
getting
it.
distracted.
You're letting the chat tempt you, right? So I know
I was trying
you're
not to, but yeah.
no
But yeah, I'll
problem.
come back on and we can have another version of this sometime.
No problem. Absolutely. I wish you nothing but all the health, all the love, all the best for you and Jamie, of course, with all your endeavors. You have been nothing but a tremendous support for each and every one of us, even the Orientals or Protestants, whoever has something to benefit from your work. So
Thanks. Yeah,
I
and
can
I
say
would
the
add
Lord
too,
bless you.
people are saying, why don't we come talk? I'm talking about on my Twitter spaces or on my Discord, right?
He
So
does.
yeah, so we do
Like
those
every
all the time. You can come follow me on Twitter. We do open forum discussions about once a week. It's about once a week in Discord as well. So that's what I'm talking about, guys, in the chat.
there are plenty of moments to have a talk with Jay. So he's not backing down or hiding. So
And
anyway.
it's always open too. So yeah.
It is. So I would say, sir, enjoy your day. Thank you very much. It has been a
Yeah. Sorry I
blessing.
was late.
No problem. There's no pressure. Absolutely.
All
Everybody,
right.
thank you all. And those who want to find me, know where to find me in the description. There's my email. If you want to curse me out, go ahead. It's no problem. Like I knew I was getting into like people were asking like, is this an OO channel or EO channel? Like so, it is what it is. So what
All
can I
right.
say,
Have a good
Jay?
night,
Thank you
man.
very much. You too.
Thank
Have a
you.
great
Bye.
day. Absolutely.